My name is Richard Dalton. I am 70 years old, a retired Chicago police captain, and a former SWAT commander. For 30 years, I hunted down the worst predators this city had to offer. I broke down doors and looked pure evil in the eye. But nothing in my 3 decades of wearing a badge prepared me for the monster sleeping in my own daughter's house. Before I continue, hit the like button if you believe a father's duty to protect his child never expires. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss a story. What I am about to tell you is how I completely dismantled my arrogant son-in-law. It all began at exactly 4 in the morning. The freezing Chicago wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the window panes of my house. It was the kind of bitter, bone-chilling cold that keeps the entire city paralyzed in silence. I am a light sleeper. 30 years on the force rewires your brain. You never really turn off. So when the doorbell started ringing frantically, followed by desperate pounding against the oak front door, I was out of bed before my eyes were fully adjusted to the dark. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and moved down the hallway with silent steps. I did not turn on the lights. I checked the peephole. What I saw on the front porch made my heart stop beating. It was my daughter, my little girl, Maya. I threw open the deadbolt and pulled the door wide. Maya is 32 years old, a sweet, trusting pediatric nurse who spends her life taking care of sick children. She has always been the light of my life, the gentle soul I swore to protect from the darkness I dealt with every day at work. But standing there in the freezing cold, she looked like a broken bird. She was barefoot, her toes red and raw from the icy concrete. She was wearing only thin pajamas and a light coat thrown hastily over her shoulders. She was shivering violently. But that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. It was her face. Her lower lip was split and bleeding, trailing a thin line of red down her chin. A dark, ugly purple bruise was already forming on her left cheekbone. Her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were swollen and filled with a terror I had only seen in the victims I used to rescue from hostage situations. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking as the freezing wind whipped her hair across her bruised face. Brad hit me. I found out about the other woman. She collapsed into my chest, sobbing uncontrollably. When Maya first brought Brad Lawson home 3 years ago, my instincts flared immediately. He was an arrogant real estate executive with a perfectly rehearsed smile, but his eyes were always calculating. I never liked him. I told Maya to be careful, but she was in love. She saw a charming, successful man who promised her the world. I saw a narcissist. But as a father, you eventually have to step back and let your children make their own choices. You hope your instincts are wrong. Standing here tonight holding my bleeding child, I knew my instincts had been right all along, and I hated myself for letting him into our family. In my 30 years wearing a police badge, I have seen thousands of battered victims. I was trained to remain completely objective, to detach my emotions, to handle the situation with cold, tactical precision. But seeing my own daughter broken, seeing the physical evidence of violence on the face of the child I raised, shattered every protocol I had ever learned. A primal, violently protective rage ignited deep in my stomach. It was a dark, consuming fire that I had not felt since my days raiding cartel hideouts. But I did not yell. I did not show her my fury. She needed her father. I pulled her inside immediately and locked the door behind us, shutting out the biting wind. I did not offer empty comforts or useless platitudes. I did not say it was going to be okay, because right now it was not okay. I guided her trembling body to the living room couch and wrapped her in the thick wool blanket from the back of the recliner. I walked into the kitchen, my mind calculating 100 different scenarios per second. I grabbed a bag of frozen peas from the freezer, wrapped it in a clean dish towel, and brought it back to her. I gently placed it against her bruised cheek. "Hold this here, sweetheart," I said, my voice low and steady. "Just breathe. You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you ever again." I left her resting on the couch and walked back to my bedroom. I opened the heavy double doors of my closet. I bypassed my comfortable retirement clothes. I reached all the way to the back. Hanging there perfectly pressed and protected in a plastic garment bag was my full Chicago police captain dress uniform. I pulled it out. I silently put on the dark blue trousers, the crisp white shirt, the heavy jacket. I pinned my silver stars to the collar. I pinned my medals of valor, the ribbons I had bled for, perfectly aligned over my left breast pocket. I laced up my boots. I was no longer just Rick, the retired old man. I was Captain Richard Dalton. I walked over to the dresser, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered on the other end. "Yeah, Rick, what is it?" It was Hank Callahan. Hank was my former partner on the force, a tactical genius who had transitioned into becoming a high-end private cybersecurity contractor after he retired. He was 68, grumpy, brilliant, and the most loyal man I have ever known. "Hank," I said, my voice as cold as the wind outside. "I need you awake. Maya is at my house." Brad put his hands on her. There was a brief, heavy silence on the line. I could hear the immediate shift in Hank breathing. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He just understood. "Give me the word," Captain Hank growled. "The plan begins." I told him, looking at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting my uniform collar. "Now." I hung up the phone. I walked back out to the living room. Maya looked up at me, her tear-filled eyes widening as she saw me standing there in my full uniform, prepared for war. "We are going to fix this, Maya," I told her calmly. "I am going to deal with your husband." I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago night. The drive from my house to their upscale suburban neighborhood took 20 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the crunch of snow beneath my tires were the only sounds accompanying the dark thoughts running through my mind. In my years on the force, I had learned that anger was a liability if you let it control you. You had to forge it into a tool. You had to become ice. By the time I pulled my truck onto their manicured driveway, my mind was perfectly clear. I did not bother knocking. I walked up to the heavy mahogany front door, planted my boot right next to the lock, and kicked it open with a single practiced strike. The wood splintered and the door slammed against the interior wall with a thunderous crash. I stepped into the foyer. I expected to find him hiding or perhaps drunk and panicking. I expected the erratic behavior of a domestic abuser who realized he had gone too far. Instead, the house was perfectly quiet. I walked up the hardwood stairs, my heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. I found him in the master bedroom. Brad was not cowering. He was not trembling. He was standing calmly by the bed, neatly folding designer shirts and placing them into a leather suitcase. He looked up when I entered. He did not even flinch. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive sweater and offered me a small, condescending smile. "I see Maya ran crying to Daddy," he said, his voice entirely too relaxed. I stood in the doorway, blocking his exit. My hands were resting comfortably at my sides, but every muscle in my body was coiled. I looked at the man who had bruised my daughter. He was 35 years old, built like someone who spent his mornings at high-end gyms, with perfectly styled hair and the smooth, untroubled face of a man who believed he was untouchable. "You put your hands on my daughter," I said. My voice was a low, steady rumble. I did not yell. Yelling is what people do when they are out of control. I was completely in control. Brad sighed and closed his suitcase. He walked over to the dresser, picked up his luxury watch, and strapped it around his wrist. "Look, Rick," he said, using my first name with a casual disrespect that grated on my nerves. "Let us not make this bigger than it needs to be. Maya is unstable. We had a disagreement, she lost her temper, and things got slightly out of hand. She needs help, not a rescue mission from an overprotective father." I took a slow, measured step into the room. I felt the familiar weight of my authority settling over my shoulders. I have put men behind bars for breathing the wrong way at a woman, I told him. You think you are going to pack a bag and walk away after hitting her? Before Brad could answer, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood. I glanced toward the bedroom window. Red and blue lights were already flashing against the frost-covered glass, casting long, frantic shadows across the room. Brad smirked. His eyes gleamed with a cold, calculated triumph. I called them 20 minutes ago, he said smoothly, right after she stormed out. Like I said, Rick, she is completely out of control. I had to secure the premises. I listened as heavy footsteps moved quickly through the front door I had just kicked open. 2 patrol officers bounded up the stairs, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They burst into the bedroom, sweeping the scene with wide eyes. They were young. Very young. They looked like they had been out of the police academy for maybe a year. They did not recognize the man standing in front of them. They did not see a decorated commander who had bled for this city long before they were born. They just saw a large, imposing older man in a uniform they barely registered in the dim light. "Step back, sir," the first officer commanded, pointing a stern finger at me. "Keep your hands where I can see them." I slowly raised my hands to chest level, complying without a word. I knew how this game was played. The second officer turned his attention to Brad, who immediately shifted his posture. Gone was the arrogant, smug executive. In an instant, Brad transformed into a distressed, exhausted victim. He slumped. His shoulders ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair to make it look disheveled, and let out a shaky breath. "Officer, thank God you are here," Brad said, his voice laced with the perfect amount of vulnerability. "I am the one who called. My wife, she had a terrible manic episode tonight." The officers relaxed slightly, turning their notebooks toward Brad. "Tell us what happened, sir," the first officer said, his tone shifting to one of sympathetic authority. Brad nodded, looking down at the floor, as if overwhelmed by shame and sadness. "It has been building for weeks," he began softly. "She has been dealing with severe paranoia. Tonight she mixed her prescription sleep medication with 2 bottles of wine. She started accusing me of insane things, screaming about other women throwing objects around the room. I tried to calm her down. I really did. But she came at me." Brad tilted his head back, pulling down the collar of his sweater just enough to reveal a thin red scratch along his collarbone. "She clawed at my neck," Brad continued, his voice trembling perfectly. "I had to push her away just to defend myself. I did not mean to hurt her, but she stumbled and hit her face against the doorframe. Then she ran out into the cold. I was terrified she was going to freeze to death. And now her father shows up, kicks my front door down, and starts threatening me." I stood there listening to the most flawless sociopathic lie I had ever witnessed. It was entirely plausible. It was the exact kind of story that exhausted patrol cops hear every single night. The erratic wife, the pills, the alcohol, the accidental injury during a struggle. He had given them a neat, tidy narrative that required absolutely zero real police work to process. The young officers exchanged a weary look. They had already made up their minds. They had already written the report in their heads. The lead officer turned to me, his expression hardening into a patronizing scowl. "Listen to me, buddy," he said, sizing me up. "I do not care how upset you are about whatever is going on between your daughter and her husband. You cannot just come over here and kick a man door in. You are lucky he is not pressing charges for breaking and entering." I stared into the eyes of this rookie. I wanted to tell him to check my badge number. I wanted to tell him to call his precinct captain and ask who Richard Dalton was. But my tactical mind held me back. If I pulled rank now, if I blew my cover and caused a massive scene, it would become a jurisdictional nightmare. Maya would be dragged into a messy public investigation. Brad had already laid the groundwork to frame her as an unstable, violent alcoholic. If I pushed these cops, they would have to arrest someone to resolve the call. And with Brad showing a defensive scratch, my daughter would be the one leaving in handcuffs. I took a deep breath, swallowing the bitter taste of pure fury. I looked at the young officer and gave a slow, defeated nod. "I hear you, son," I said, keeping my voice mild and compliant. "I just wanted to make sure she was safe." I let my shoulders drop, playing the part of the tired, helpless old father who had overreacted. The officers relaxed entirely. "Look," the second cop said, his tone softening with pity. "Domestic calls are messy. It is always a he said, she said situation. Nobody wins. The best thing you can do right now is just take your daughter home. Let her sleep off the pills and the alcohol. Keep her away from here until things cool down. If she comes back tonight, we will have to take her in for domestic assault. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly," I replied. I looked over at Brad. He was standing behind the officer's safe and protected by the very badge I used to wear. He offered me a faint, mocking nod, his eyes gleaming with victory. He had outsmarted the system. He had weaponized my own brothers in blue against me. He truly believed he had won. I turned away, gripping the handle of my jacket, preparing to walk out of that house and leave him to his temporary triumph. But I was not a defeated old man. I was a hunter gathering intelligence, and my eyes were scanning every square inch of that room. I walked slowly toward the splintered doorframe. Every step was deliberate. I knew how to retreat tactically. You never turn your back completely on a threat. You give them a false sense of security while maintaining total situational awareness. Brad stood tall, exuding the smug satisfaction of a man who believed his plausible lie had shielded him entirely. He had neutralized the immediate threat, pacified the local law enforcement, and humiliated his father-in-law, all in one smooth motion. The young patrol officers began writing down his contact information, completely oblivious to the predator standing right in front of them. They thanked him for his cooperation and promised to file a standard incident report. I listened to their boots shifting on the hardwood floor. I knew the exact procedures they were following, and I knew how easily those procedures could be manipulated by a skilled liar. Brad had executed a flawless defense, but the best criminals always make one fatal mistake when they think they have successfully cleared the room. As I reached the hallway, I paused. I let the silence of the house wash over me, locking away my rage and replacing it with absolute, unbreakable resolve. The battle had just begun. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing the rigid military posture out of my spine. I had spent 30 years teaching young recruits how to project authority, how to dominate a room with physical presence. Now I had to become the stereotype they expected to see, an emotionally exhausted father who had simply let his temper get the better of him. I lowered my gaze to the hardwood floor and let out a raspy sigh. "You boys are right," I said, making sure my voice carried a subtle tremor of defeat. "I am just a tired old man. I was worried about my little girl and I overreacted. I apologize for the disturbance. I will get out of your hair and let you finish your paperwork." The two patrol officers visibly relaxed. The tension evaporated from the room. One of them gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder as he stepped past me. "Have a good night, sir," he said, mentally moving on to his next call. "Just drive safe and let the dust settle." Brad was standing by the bedroom door, glowing with smug satisfaction. He had played the system perfectly. He had neutralized the threat. He watched me shuffle out of the master bedroom, his eyes silently mocking my retreat. He believed he had beaten a seasoned police captain. He thought I was leaving with nothing but shame. He was wrong. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the stairs, I kept my pace slow and deliberate. I knew every inch of this house. I had paid for it. I had spent weeks helping Maya set up the furniture. To my right was the home office Brad insisted on having. The double French doors were wide open. I did not turn my head. A rookie mistake is staring directly at your target. Instead, I used my peripheral vision, letting the ambient light from the street lamps outside guide my eyes as I passed the threshold. My tactical training kicked in, taking mental snapshots of the room in fractions of a second. The mahogany desk was cluttered with papers. The leather chair was pushed back in a hurry. But what caught my attention was the painting on the back wall. The canvas was swung wide open on its concealed hinges. Behind it, built directly into the drywall, was a steel wall safe. The metal door of the safe was ajar. My mind instantly began to process this information. When Maya had shown up at my door at 4 a.m, shivering and bleeding, she said she had confronted him about an affair. She had found a burner phone with messages from another woman. A standard domestic dispute. But a cheating husband does not leave his hidden wall safe open in the middle of a physical altercation. A man whose only secret is a mistress does not scramble to access a secure vault while his wife is running out the front door in terror. I stopped at the top of the stairs, pretending to adjust the collar of my winter coat. I let out a cough to justify my pause. I glanced back down the hallway using the reflection of a decorative mirror on the landing to observe the bedroom door. The officers were finishing their notes. They were asking Brad for his signature on a statement form. One officer had his head down writing. The other turned his back to look out the window. Brad was holding the pen, but his eyes were darting down the hallway toward the open doors of his home office. The mask of the victim was slipping. He was sweating. A sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead, despite the temperature outside. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles twitched. He looked like a cornered animal. He looked like a man who was terrified of losing something much more valuable than his marriage. I stood perfectly still, controlling my breathing, blending into the shadows. I watched as Brad handed the clipboard back to the young officer. He offered a polite, weary smile. The officers nodded, entirely fooled by his performance. They turned to walk back into the bedroom to inspect the damaged doorframe. That was the exact second the officers diverted their attention, and Brad moved. He did not walk. He glided with a desperate, frantic urgency. He slipped out of the bedroom and darted straight into his home office. He was completely unaware of my reflection in the hallway mirror. I watched him approach the open wall safe. He did not grab stacks of cash. He did not reach for jewelry. His hand reached deep into the back corner of the steel vault. When he pulled his hand out, I saw exactly what he was trying to protect. It was a USB drive. It was small, encased in a rugged military-grade black rubber shell, the kind of encrypted flash drive used by private contractors and high-level corporate executives to store untraceable data. Brad clutched the small black device as if his life depended on it. He quickly shoved the USB drive deep into the inside breast pocket of his designer jacket. He patted the pocket from the outside, ensuring the drive was secure against his chest. He then reached up, slammed the heavy steel door of the safe shut, spun the combination dial, and swung the canvas painting back into place, concealing the vault entirely. He took a deep breath, smoothed the front of his sweater, and stepped back out into the hallway. By the time Brad looked toward the stairs, I was already gone. I was walking out the splintered front door, my boots hitting the icy concrete of the driveway. The freezing Chicago wind hit my face again, but I barely felt it. I climbed up into my truck and shut the door. I had spent my entire career putting violent men behind bars. I knew how domestic abusers operated. They operate on ego. When they are caught, they panic about their reputation. They try to mitigate the social damage. But a man who just accidentally hit his wife does not prioritize a black encrypted USB drive at 5 a.m. He does not risk hiding a digital vault while the police are standing just 10 feet away. The burner phone Maya found was just a tiny crack in a massive unseen dam. He called the cops himself, orchestrating a perfect distraction to secure his asset. He needed the police to close the scene quickly to protect his data. This was not just an affair. Brad Lawson was hiding millions of dollars, and my trusting daughter was entangled in a criminal web she could not comprehend. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit the call button for Hank Callahan. He answered on the very first ring, his voice sharp and fully awake. "Are we moving now, Captain, or waiting for sunrise?" he asked. "We are moving right now, Hank," I said, shifting the heavy truck into gear. "But the old mission parameters have changed. Set up the secure server. We are going to tear his life apart piece by digital piece. I drove back through the frozen empty streets of Chicago. The heater was running at full blast, but the chill inside the cabin had nothing to do with the winter. My mind was locked onto that small encrypted USB drive I had just seen Brad slide into his jacket. A standard cheating husband does not possess military-grade data storage. A cheating husband does not execute a manipulation of 2 patrol officers to buy time to secure a digital vault. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. Inside the house, the quiet felt heavy. Maya was still sitting exactly where I had left her, the bag of frozen peas resting gently against her bruised cheek. She looked up at me, her eyes red, exhausted, and filled with sorrow. I did not tell her about the hidden wall safe or the black USB drive. She was already carrying too much weight, and I needed to shield her from the tactical realities of what was about to happen. I helped her up from the couch and guided her down the hallway to her bedroom. It had remained untouched since she moved out a safe harbor. Before she climbed into bed, she reached into the pocket of her winter coat. Her hand was trembling as she pulled out a small plastic cell phone. It was a prepaid burner, the kind you buy with cash at a gas station and throw away when the job is done. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is what started the horrible fight. I went out to his car to get my charger, and I found this stuffed under the passenger seat. I turned it on. I saw recent messages. A woman named Diana. He caught me holding it in the garage. He panicked completely. He tried to grab it from me, and when I pulled away, he hit me hard. I took the phone from her hand. The plastic felt cold against my palm. I promised that I would handle it. I pulled the quilt over her shoulders, turned off the lamp, and gently closed the bedroom door. She needed to sleep. I needed to go to war. 30 minutes later, headlights swept across my front window. Hank Callahan did not knock. He used the spare key I had given him 20 years ago and pushed through the front door. He was carrying 2 reinforced Pelican cases. Hank was a bear of a man, wide-shouldered and thick with a gray beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. We had ridden in the same squad car for a decade before I moved to SWAT Command, and he moved to the Cyber Division. He dropped the heavy cases onto my dining room table with a thud. He did not ask how I was doing. He knew me entirely too well for useless pleasantries. "Let us see what your scumbag son-in-law is hiding," Hank said gruffly, unlatching the metal clips of his equipment cases. Within 5 minutes, my dining room table was transformed into a sophisticated digital forensics laboratory. Hank booted up a pair of hardened military-grade laptops connecting a complex web of cables to specialized extraction hardware that hummed with power. I handed him the cheap burner phone Maya had found. He turned it over in his large hands, closely examining the casing. "A basic, prepaid, disposable," Hank muttered, shaking his head in mild disgust. "Amateurs always think these cheap things make them invisible. They forget that every digital action leaves a permanent footprint if you know exactly where to shine the flashlight." He plugged a data cable into the charging port of the burner phone and linked it directly into his primary terminal. His thick fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, typing command prompts into a black terminal window with terrifying speed. I stood silently behind him, watching endless strings of green code cascade rapidly down the bright screen. In the old days, we kicked in reinforced doors and tossed dirty rooms to find physical ledgers hidden in shoeboxes. Now the criminal ledgers were completely invisible, hidden behind complex passwords and biometric security locks. But the fundamental rules of the hunt had never changed. Criminals always left a trail, because overwhelming arrogance always breeds terminal carelessness. The phone screen blinked twice, and Hank successfully bypassed the rudimentary security firewall in less than 60 seconds. "I have the entire messaging cache," Hank announced, adjusting his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. He is using a heavily encrypted third-party application, specifically designed to auto-delete text messages immediately after reading. But the flawed application inherently stores fragmented data packets in the background registry of the operating system. "Give me a minute to fully reconstruct the dialogue strings." I paced the length of the kitchen, my heavy boots echoing against the tile floor. I poured 2 cups of strong black coffee and set one down next to Hank. I stared out the dark window, waiting patiently. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of Hank hitting the keys. "Got it," he said softly. The recovered text logs populated clearly on his right monitor. I leaned in closely, bracing myself to read the sordid details of a pathetic, extramarital affair. But as my eyes scanned the reconstructed messages, the narrative completely changed in an instant. These were not romantic texts sent to a hidden mistress named Diana. There were absolutely no sweet words or secret hotel rendezvous arrangements. The messages were entirely composed of complex alphanumeric sequences, international bank routing instructions, and highly technical financial jargon. Diana Transfer Sequence Alpha Tango 4 requires immediate offshore routing. Confirm the shell company deposit in the Cayman account before morning. Another message read, "Local equity extraction is complete. Wipe the secondary digital ledger immediately." The final message, sent just moments before Maya had discovered the hidden phone, read, "The primary cargo is secured. Do not initiate contact on this secure line again until the Friday departure." I felt a cold, hard knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. My eyes slowly traced the long string of offshore routing numbers and the heavily encrypted banking transfer codes. This was not a man hiding a casual affair from his trusting wife. This was a man moving massive sums of untraceable currency across international borders. He was actively laundering illicit money, and based on the specific terminology utilized, he was doing it at a highly sophisticated professional level. The cheap burner phone was just the temporary communication link. The black USB drive I had seen him hide inside the wall safe was the actual financial ledger. Hank leaned back heavily in his chair, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. He shook his head, a dry, humorless chuckle suddenly escaping his throat. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming brightly with the sharp, predatory focus of an old detective who had just caught the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. He really thought he could hide offshore routing numbers from the guy who dismantled the Southside cartels. Hank joked, his deep voice laced with pure, absolute disdain. I did not smile at his joke. The reality of the situation was settling over me like a heavy lead blanket. Brad was not just a cheating husband who had lost his temper. He was an active participant in a sophisticated financial syndicate, and he had dragged my daughter into the blast radius. Hank turned back to his monitors, the blue light reflecting in his eyes as his thick fingers resumed their frantic dance across the keyboard. "We need to figure out who Diana actually is," I told him, pouring the last of the coffee into my mug. "She is not just some random woman he met at a hotel bar. She is the architect of this operation." Hank nodded, opening a series of encrypted search databases he retained from his days working federal task forces. He ran the alphanumeric routing codes alongside the name Diana and the geographical tags associated with Brad and his recent travel logs. It took less than 20 minutes for the facial recognition software to find a match. Hank pulled up a high-resolution corporate photograph on his left monitor. Diana Pierce. She was 30 years old. She looked like a runway model, but her professional resume read like a white-collar criminal defense file. She was a senior partner at a boutique wealth management firm operating out of a sleek glass tower in the downtown financial district. But according to the deep dive Hank executed into her professional history, her official title was merely a decorative mask. She did not manage retirement portfolios for wealthy doctors or dentists. Her firm specialized in creating complex networks of anonymous shell companies. She was a professional ghost. Her entire career was built on hiding money for people who could not afford to have their names attached to their bank accounts. Brad was not sleeping with her because he was bored with his marriage. He was sleeping with her because she held the keys to his offshore vaults. He was keeping his money launderer as close as possible to ensure his financial secrets remained secure. "Let us look at your son-in-law," Hank murmured, cracking his knuckles before diving into the public financial footprint of Brad and his real estate company. Brad ran a mid-sized commercial real estate development firm. On paper, it looked like a standard, moderately successful business. They bought old warehouses, renovated them into overpriced loft apartments, and sold them to wealthy tech executives. It was a perfect, boring cover. But Hank was not looking at the glossy promotional brochures. He was looking at the raw, unedited tax filings and property acquisition ledgers. He cross-referenced the dates of the real estate purchases with the encrypted transfer coordinates we had just pulled from the burner phone. The pattern emerged instantly. It was so blatant it made my blood boil. Every single time the firm purchased a new piece of commercial property, a massive, untraceable cash injection miraculously appeared in his corporate holding accounts just 48 hours prior. He was not securing legitimate bank loans to fund his developments. He was taking dirty money, funneling it through the shell companies Diana meticulously managed, and washing it clean through legitimate real estate transactions. He was turning ghost money into brick-and-mortar reality. Hank brought up a series of bar charts and financial graphs, highlighting the staggering volume of cash moving through the accounts. In the last 14 months alone, Brad had washed over $12 million. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. He was not a low-level player. He was a primary conduit for some very dangerous people. I stared at the screen, my mind flashing back to the young patrol cops who had stood in the bedroom just an hour ago. They had looked at him and seen a stressed, exhausted husband dealing with a manic wife. They had no idea they were standing in the presence of a man moving cartel-level funds through the Chicago real estate market. And Maya had been sleeping in the bed right next to him, completely oblivious to the empire of lies he was building around her. "This changes everything," Hank said, his voice dropping an octave as he pointed at a newly decrypted ledger. "He is accelerating the transfers. Look at the dates on these last 3 routing codes. He is dumping assets fast. He is preparing to liquidate." I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the digital timestamps. Brad was not just washing money anymore. He was actively emptying his domestic accounts. He was consolidating his funds and moving them permanently offshore. The USB drive I had seen him hide in the wall safe was the master key to his escape plan. He was getting ready to run. "He hit her because she found the phone," I said, my voice dangerously calm. He was not afraid of a divorce. He was afraid she was going to expose his entire criminal network. Hank nodded slowly, his eyes locked on the scrolling data. The affair was just a byproduct of the business arrangement. Diana is his broker. She sets up the offshore accounts, creates the shell corporations, and ensures the dirty cash flows smoothly into his real estate firm. Once the money is washed through the property developments, it comes out clean on the other side. But if Maya had taken that phone to a divorce attorney, or worse, to the police, the entire laundering operation would have collapsed instantly. I took a slow breath, letting the magnitude of the situation settle into my bones. Brad was operating at a level of criminality that carried federal prison sentences. He had built an elaborate illusion of wealth and success, using my daughter as the perfect prop for his respectable suburban lifestyle. A beautiful nurse for a wife, a quiet home in a good neighborhood, a retired police captain for a father-in-law. It was the ultimate camouflage. No one suspects the handsome real estate executive married to a pediatric nurse. "We need to trace where the money is going right now," I instructed Hank, pointing at the offshore routing numbers. "If he is liquidating his assets, he is preparing for an endgame. I need to know exactly how much cash he has moved, and I need to know if he has compromised any of Maya and her own personal finances to facilitate this operation." Hank cracked his neck and leaned back into his monitors. He began running a specialized tracing algorithm designed to punch through the complex layers of corporate anonymity Diana had constructed. He bypassed proxy servers and shell company registrations, digging straight down into the bedrock of Brad and his financial history. I stood there in the quiet of my dining room, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my daughter sleeping down the hall. She had come to me seeking refuge from a broken heart and a bruised face. She thought her world was falling apart because her husband was unfaithful. She had absolutely no idea that she was legally tethered to a man who was actively defrauding the federal government and laundering millions of dollars for unseen criminals. I watched the screen as Hank leaned forward, his amusement fading into a hardened glare. The digital breadcrumbs we had followed so far were damning enough to put Brad away for a decade. But Hank was thorough. He was the kind of investigator who never stopped digging until he reached the absolute bottom of the pit. He shifted his focus away from the offshore accounts and the complex web of corporate entities Diana Pierce managed. He began to cross-reference Brad and his personal financial footprint with the local county property databases. If Brad was liquidating assets to run, Hank reasoned he would pull capital from every available well. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard filled the dining room once again. I poured myself another cup of coffee. The dark liquid felt like acid in my stomach, but I needed the caffeine to keep my mind sharp. I thought about Maya sleeping just a few rooms away. I thought about how she had cried against my chest, believing her entire world had collapsed simply because of another woman. She did not know that her husband was a financial predator. She did not know the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wrapping its cold fingers around her life. Suddenly the clicking stopped. Hank sat perfectly still. He pushed his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose and stared at the glowing monitor. He did not say a word for a long time. The silence stretched until it felt heavy, thick with a sudden, unspoken tension. Hank had seen the worst of humanity during our time on the force. He had looked at crime scenes that would break an ordinary man. So when I saw his jaw clench, when I saw the color drain slightly from his weathered face, I knew he had found something terrible. "What is it, Hank?" I asked, my voice steady but tight. Hank let out a long, slow breath. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and deep, abiding anger. "Rick," he said quietly. He tapped the screen with a thick finger. "I need you to look at this document. I just pulled it from the county recorder office. It was filed 3 weeks ago." I stepped up behind his chair and leaned over his shoulder. The document displayed on the monitor was a standard real estate filing. It was a secondary mortgage agreement. I scanned the text, reading the property address. It was Maya and Brad and their house, the house I had just left, the house where my daughter had been struck. I moved my eyes down to the financial figures. My breath caught in my throat. Brad had taken out a secondary loan against the property. He had extracted equity. The total loan amount was $800,000. A cold, blinding fury spiked through my chest, radiating out to my fingertips. My hands gripped the back of Hank and his leather chair so hard the wood frame groaned in protest. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, but the rage was a living, breathing thing inside me. That house was not just a piece of real estate. 3 years ago, when Maya told me she was getting married, she brought Brad to dinner. They talked about their future, about wanting to buy a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood to start a family. Brad made a grand speech about how he was saving money, how he wanted to provide for her. But I knew how much those houses cost, and I knew how much pressure a massive mortgage puts on a young couple. I had spent my entire life saving my money. I never took expensive vacations. I drove the same truck for 15 years. I lived simply so I could build a safety net for my daughter. When they found that house, the beautiful 2-story colonial, with the wrap-around porch and the large backyard, Maya fell in love with it immediately. So I went to the bank. I withdrew my life savings. I bought that house for them in cash. It was my wedding gift to my little girl. I wanted her to have a sanctuary. I wanted her to have a safe haven that belonged entirely to her, a place where she would never have to worry about the threat of foreclosure or financial ruin. I handed them the deed, free and clear. And now, looking at the glowing screen in my dining room, I realized what Brad had done. He had taken the sanctuary I built for my daughter and turned it into his personal piggy bank. He had gutted the equity to fund his criminal enterprise or to pad his escape fund. But the sheer audacity of the crime went far beyond simple theft. "Hank," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed violence, That house is fully paid for, and Maya is on the primary deed. He cannot take out an $800,000 mortgage without her explicit notarized consent. She would never agree to this. She would have told me. Hank nodded grimly. He clicked the mouse, zooming in on the final page of the digital document. The signature lines were displayed in high resolution. There was Brad and his signature, smooth and confident. And right below it, in perfect flowing cursive, was the signature of my daughter. I stared at the looping letters. It looked exactly like her handwriting. It was a flawless replication. But I knew my daughter. I knew she had spent the last 3 weeks working double shifts at the hospital. I knew she had not sat down in front of a notary public to sign away her home. He forged it. I said the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He forged my daughter and her signature on federal bank documents. Hank pulled up the notary stamp on the document and ran a quick background trace on the name. The notary is registered to a Diana Pierce, Hank said, confirming our worst suspicions. His wealth manager. His mistress. She stamped the forged documents. They walked into a bank together, completely fabricated Maya and her presence, and stole $800,000 right out from under her. They stole the sanctuary you built to keep her safe. I turned away from the table, staring out the dark window. The betrayal was absolute. Brad had weaponized my own life savings against my blood. He was going to leave her destitute. If he defaulted on this hidden loan, the bank would foreclose on the property. Maya would be thrown out onto the street. She would be left with nothing but a ruined credit score and a massive debt anchor dragging her down. The pieces of the puzzle were locking into place. Brad was liquidating every asset he could access. He needed clean, legitimate capital to fund his new life abroad. My savings trapped in the equity of that house had become his golden ticket. I walked back to the dining room table. I was no longer just an angry father seeking payback for a bruised cheek. I was a commander preparing for total war. The sun began to rise over the frozen Chicago skyline. Hank had not moved from his chair for 3 hours, tracing the forged mortgage documents back through a maze of corporate firewalls. I stood by the counter watching the digital map of Brad and his criminal network expand. You know, Hank said, digging this deep into his credit history will set off automated alerts. Brad is going to know someone is looking. I nodded slowly. I know, I replied. Let him know. I want him to make a mistake. But Brad did not make a mistake. He made a tactical counterstrike. He knew exactly how to manipulate the legal system. By 10, exactly while Maya was still resting, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet house. I did not expect Brad to show up. Criminals like him do not confront their enemies face to face. They use proxies. I pulled the door open. Standing on my front porch were 2 uniformed Chicago police officers. One was a patrolman. The other was a seasoned sergeant whose face I recognized from my last few years working out of the downtown precinct. The sergeant looked deeply uncomfortable. Captain Dalton, the sergeant said, his voice respectful but tight with official duty. I apologize for the intrusion, sir. I hate to be the one doing this, but we have a court order to serve. He handed me a thick manila envelope. I took it, feeling the weight of the legal documents. What is this, Sergeant? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. It is an emergency temporary restraining order, sir, the sergeant explained, refusing to meet my eyes. It was filed this morning by Bradley Lawson. The judge signed off immediately based on his sworn affidavit. Sir, you are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Lawson, his personal residence or his corporate offices. You are also prohibited from contacting him. I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp, white papers. I flipped to the second page, scanning the sworn affidavit Brad had submitted under penalty of perjury. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. It was the ultimate plausible lie, carefully crafted by a man who knew exactly which buttons to push to manipulate a judge. According to the affidavit, Brad claimed that I had violently kicked down his front door in the middle of the night. He completely omitted the fact that Maya had fled to my house bleeding. Instead, he swore under oath that I was an unstable, armed ex-police captain suffering from severe early-onset dementia. He He claimed my grip on reality was slipping, that I possessed a massive arsenal of unregistered firearms, and that I had explicitly threatened to murder him. He painted himself as a terrified, innocent husband who feared for his life and his wife. The audacity of the document was staggering. He had taken the tragic reality of my daughter and twisted it into a narrative where he was the victim and I was the aggressor. He knew the family court system inherently defaults to caution when firearms and former police officers are involved. He knew no judge would risk ignoring a claim of a violent armed man suffering from dementia. He had legally paralyzed me. "Captain," the sergeant continued, his voice dropping lower, almost apologetic, "because of the specific nature of the allegations regarding your mental state and the firearms, the judge also ordered a temporary surrender of your primary weapons. I am going to need to ask you to hand over your registered carry piece until we can get this sorted out at a formal hearing next week." I looked at the sergeant. He was just doing his job. He was bound by the paper in my hand. I could not fight him without proving Brad right. If I showed anger, it would be documented in the police report and used to validate the claim that I was unstable. A commander never surrenders his temper when the enemy is watching. "Of course, Sergeant," I said smoothly, stepping back to let them into the foyer. "I completely understand. You are just executing the judge and his orders. Give me a moment to retrieve my registered weapon from the safe." I walked down the hall to my bedroom. I bypassed the hidden tactical safe in the floorboards. Instead, I opened the standard metal lockbox in my closet. I pulled out my department-issued service pistol, unloaded the magazine, cleared the chamber, and placed it inside a hard plastic carrying case. It was the weapon the city knew about. It was not the only weapon I owned. I walked back to the front door and handed the case to the sergeant. "Thank you for your cooperation, Captain," the sergeant said, looking genuinely relieved. "I suggest you get a good lawyer. This guy Lawson seems like a real piece of work. The hearing is scheduled for next Thursday. Until then, please stay away from him. We do not want to come back here and arrest a decorated officer." "I will not give you a reason to, Sergeant," I replied. "Be safe out there." I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into the dining room and dropped the restraining order onto the table next to Hank and his glowing monitors. Hank picked up the legal document, read through the affidavit, and let out a low whistle. "Early onset dementia," Hank read aloud, shaking his head. "That is a nice touch. He is trying to discredit you before you can take the financial evidence to the authorities. If you walk into a federal building claiming your son-in-law is laundering cartel money, they will look at this restraining order, assume you are a crazy old man having a paranoid episode, and throw you into a psychiatric hold. He is legally suffocating you." "He thinks he is," I corrected him, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "He thinks this piece of paper is a concrete wool. He thinks because I cannot walk up to him or call him, I am completely neutralized. He is buying himself time to finalize the offshore transfers. He needs exactly 1 week to liquidate the remaining assets and board a plane to the Cayman Islands." Hank looked at me, his fingers resting on the keyboard. "So what is the play, Rick? If you violate this order, you go to jail. If you go to jail, Maya is left unprotected, and Brad gets away with millions and walks free." I leaned forward, resting my 2 elbows on the solid oak table, staring intensely at the flashing green codes on the screen. "The play is exactly what it was an hour ago," I said softly. "We do not stop. We dig deeper." Brad filed an affidavit claiming I am a confused old man who does not understand the modern world. We are going to use that arrogance against him. A man who thinks his enemy is blind will always speak entirely too loudly. He safely locked the heavy front door. We are going to slowly tear down all the walls from the inside. The first light of morning crept through the frost-covered windows of my living room, casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept a single minute. Hank had stayed at the dining room table all night, his eyes glued to the glowing monitors, as he continued to map out the complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies my son-in-law had meticulously constructed. I was sitting in the kitchen nursing my 4th cup of black coffee when I heard the soft padding of footsteps coming down the hallway. Maya suddenly appeared in the doorway. She was wearing one of my old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists, and her face looked pale and exhausted. The purple bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, a stark reminder of the violence that had brought her to my door. She offered me a weak, trembling smile and walked over to the kitchen island. She pulled out her cell phone and opened a grocery delivery application. She told me she wanted to order some breakfast supplies, some fresh fruit and eggs, just to feel a sense of normalcy after the chaos of the previous night. I watched her tap the screen, her fingers moving quickly as she filled the digital cart. But a few seconds later, a sharp chime echoed from the phone. A small red error message flashed across the screen. Payment declined. Maya frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She muttered something under her breath and manually typed in her credit card information, again assuming it was a simple processing error. The red message flashed a second time. Declined. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. A cold, familiar sense of dread began to pool deep in my stomach right then. Try a different card, I told her, my voice low and calm. Maya reached into her purse, pulled out a secondary bank card linked to their joint checking account, and updated the payment method on the screen. She pressed the confirmation button. The result was exactly the same. Declined. Panic began to wash over her face. She immediately dialed the customer service number on the back of the card, placing the phone on speaker so I could hear the automated prompts. After navigating the frustrating menu, a polite but firm bank representative answered the call and asked her full name. Maya identified herself and asked why her accounts were suddenly restricted. The representative hesitated for a moment before reading from a prepared script. She explained that Bradley Lawson, the primary account holder, had contacted the fraud department at 6 in the morning. He had initiated a total freeze on all joint financial assets, invoking a standard clause known as marital dispute protection. He had legally paralyzed her entire financial existence. He had cut off her access to their savings, her checking account, and every single line of credit they shared. Maya dropped the phone onto the smooth, cold kitchen counter. She stared at the blank screen, completely immobilized by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. He took everything, she whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. He took all of my money, Dad. My nursing salary is directly deposited into that joint account. I have absolutely nothing left. I walked around the kitchen island and pulled her into a tight embrace. I held her as she wept, feeling the trembling of her shoulders against my chest. This is textbook behavior for an abuser, I told her gently. They always try to isolate you. They try to cut off your financial resources. Brad knows he cannot physically control you anymore because you are here with me, so he is trying to control you financially. He wants you to panic. He wants you to feel like you have no way to survive without him. Just as I was speaking the words, the distinct rattle of the metal mailbox on the front porch interrupted the quiet of the morning. The postal carrier had just delivered the Daily Mail. I pulled away from Maya, gave her a reassuring nod, and walked to the front door. I retrieved a small stack of letters and returned inside. I sifted through the junk mail and the utility bills until my eyes landed on a stark, official-looking envelope addressed to Maya and Brad. The return address belonged to a major national mortgage lender. My heart sank. Hank had already uncovered the hidden $800,000 equity extraction loan the previous night, but seeing the physical documentation in my hands made the reality of the crime profoundly visceral. I tore the envelope open and pulled out a heavy multi-page document printed on thick white paper. It was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose immediately. The document clearly stated that the secondary mortgage, the massive loan Brad had secured using a forged signature of my daughter, was currently 60 days past due in payments. The bank was officially initiating the legal process to seize the property. The house I had purchased for Maya with my life savings, the home that was supposed to be her safe haven, was about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder because Brad had deliberately defaulted on the fraudulent loan. He had never intended to make a single payment. He had siphoned the massive sum of cash straight out. He funneled it into his offshore laundering network, Now he was simply letting the bank take the house, leaving Maya to shoulder the devastating financial ruin while he prepared to flee the country. Maya read the bold black letters at the top of the page. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. "He is going to take my home," she gasped, stepping back until she hit the edge of the refrigerator. "He is going to destroy my credit, take my house, and leave me with a massive debt I can never ever repay him. Dad, how could he do this to me? How could I have been so blind to the monster I was living with?" She was hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the sudden poverty and legal jeopardy Brad had orchestrated. He had executed a flawless financial chokehold designed to break her spirit and distract me from his broader criminal enterprise. I placed the paper down. "Do not panic," I told her firmly. I walked out of the kitchen and opened the heavy wooden door that led down to the basement, descending the stairs into the cool, dry basement darkness. In the far corner stood a massive tactical gun safe bolted directly into the concrete foundation. I spun the mechanical dial, entered the code, and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, resting next to my old service weapons, was a locked metal box. I opened it to reveal thick bands of emergency cash I kept from my days working undercover. I grabbed the stacks of $100 bills and walked back upstairs. I dropped the money onto the kitchen counter in front of Maya. "He thinks he can starve us out. He forgot who he picked a fight with." Maya stared at the stacks of $100 bills resting on the granite countertop. Her eyes moved from the banded currency up to my face, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen that kind of money outside of a bank vault, let alone sitting in my kitchen. "I told you I would handle this," I said, pushing the cash toward her trembling hands. "This is enough to keep your accounts open, pay any immediate legal retainers, and ensure you have complete financial independence while we dismantle the cage he built around you. Do not let his legal maneuvers make you feel powerless. You are my daughter, and you are protected." She reached out and touched the paper bands, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her eyelashes. She wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder, finally letting go of the crippling anxiety that had gripped her since the morning mail arrived. I held her until her breathing slowed and steadied. "Go take a hot shower," I instructed softly. "Lock the bathroom door, let the water run, and try to clear your head. I have work to do." I left her in the kitchen and walked back into the dining room. Hank had not moved from his command station. The monitors reflected a harsh glare against his face. The digital battleground had shifted. While I was upstairs managing the emotional fallout of the foreclosure notice, Hank had launched a relentless cyber assault on the primary servers of the boutique wealth management firm operated by Diana Pierce. He was not just tracing routing numbers anymore. He was actively breaking down the digital doors of her shell companies. Hank typed a rapid sequence of commands, his thick fingers striking the keys with the heavy, deliberate rhythm of a man closing in on his prey. "Diana is good," Hank muttered, not taking his eyes off the cascading lines of encrypted data. She routed the equity through 3 international holding accounts before bringing it stateside. She tried to wash the $800,000 so thoroughly that it would be indistinguishable from legitimate corporate revenue. But she made a mistake. She tied a secondary proxy server to her personal administrative credentials. I just punched through the final firewall. The screen flashed green, and a massive directory of hidden corporate files suddenly populated the monitor. We were inside the ghost network. Hank quickly ran a search query using Brad and his social security number, cross-referencing it with the exact dollar amount stolen from Maya and her home equity. The system hummed for a fraction of a second before isolating a single heavily encrypted folder. Hank bypassed the local password requirement and opened the directory. I leaned over his shoulder, bracing myself to see the final destination of the stolen house funds. I expected to find a wire transfer for a luxury villa or a massive deposit into a cryptocurrency wallet. But what appeared on the screen was not an offshore banking ledger. It was a formal legal contract spanning 40 pages bearing the logo of a premier international insurance conglomerate. "What is this?" I asked, squinting at the dense legal jargon filling the digital page. Hank scrolled down to the primary summary section. The color completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack, and he slowly took off his reading glasses, letting them fall onto the keyboard. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our 20-year friendship, I saw genuine, unadulterated horror in his eyes. Rick, Hank whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. He did not send the $800,000 offshore. He used it to pay a massive lump sum premium. He bought a policy. I stared at the screen, my heart turning to ice. I read the bold black text at the top of the contract. It was a comprehensive premium life insurance policy. The insured party listed on the document was my daughter. The policy had been activated exactly 4 days ago. The coverage was exactly $4 million. The air in the room felt too thin to breathe. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the evil staring back at me from the glowing monitor. Brad had not just stolen my life savings to fund an escape. He had used the equity from my daughter and her safe haven to place a $4 million bounty on her head. The domestic violence, the sudden burst of rage in their garage, the burner phone, it was all part of a rapidly accelerating timeline. But the nightmare did not end there. "Look at the rider clause," Hank said, pointing a shaking finger at a highlighted section near the bottom of the first page. "Look at the specific stipulations Diana drafted into the contract." I leaned closer, my eyes tracing the legal text. It was a double indemnity provision. The clause explicitly stated that if the insured party died as a result of an unforeseen accident, a tragic fall, a fatal car crash, or a random violent encounter, the payout would immediately double. If Maya died an accidental death, the policy would pay out $8 million in untraceable, completely legal, tax-free cash. And sitting alone on the beneficiary line, written in stark, undeniable black text, was Bradley Lawson. The reality of the document hit me like a physical blow. My breath was knocked away. The financial laundering, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, they were merely the mechanics of his everyday greed. But this policy was something else entirely. It was a death warrant. Brad was not simply planning to leave Maya bankrupt and destitute. He was planning to murder her. He had orchestrated the perfect, horrific exit strategy. He would eliminate his wife, collect an $8 million accidental death payout, wash the blood money through Diana and her ghost network, and disappear into the wind as a wealthy, grieving widower. The restraining order he had filed against me that morning was not just a legal maneuver to keep me away from his finances. It was a calculated, tactical blockade designed to isolate Maya. He needed me disarmed and legally barred from intervening so he could execute the final phase of his plan without interference. He was going to kill my little girl. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of the computer processors. A dark, violent storm broke loose inside my chest. The protective instincts of a father merged perfectly with the cold, lethal training of a veteran tactical commander. The man who had smiled at my dinner table, the man who had promised to protect my daughter, had coldly priced her life at $8 million. He had forged her signature, stolen her home, and written her execution order. Hank slowly looked up at me, reading the shift in my posture. "The investigation is over. Rick." Hank stated softly, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "This is no longer a white-collar financial case. We are looking at a premeditated homicide in progress. We must go stop him right now." Hank slammed his heavy palm against the wooden edge of the dining room table, the sudden crack echoing sharply in the tense silence. He turned his attention back to the glowing screens, his fingers flying across the mechanical keys with a renewed, desperate urgency. If Brad had a life insurance policy set to pay out $8 million upon accidental death, and he was simultaneously liquidating his domestic assets, there had to be a concrete exit strategy. Hank bypassed another layer of Diana Pierce and her encrypted communications network. He began scanning through her personal travel itineraries, financial confirmations, and digital booking receipts. It took him exactly 10 minutes to find the smoking gun. He pulled up a confirmed reservation from a luxury international airline. "Look at the departure date," Hank said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He highlighted a block of text near the top of the digital receipt. "Brad and Diana are not just planning to run. They have a hard deadline." I leaned over his shoulder and read the glowing green letters. Brad had purchased 2 one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands. The departure date was set for next Friday at 11. The flight was booked under his name, and Diana Pierce paid for using one of the untraceable corporate shell accounts. I felt a cold, jagged shard of ice slide directly into my heart. I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was currently Sunday morning. Next Friday was exactly 5 days away. 5. That was the entire duration of my daughter and her remaining life expectancy, according to the man she had married. The chilling realization washed over me completely, altering the gravity of the situation. Brad was not simply planning to file for a messy divorce and leave Maya broke. He was not just trying to steal the equity from her house to fund a lavish new life in the Caribbean with his wealth manager. He needed the $8 million of clean, legally obtained, tax-free cash to fund his escape because the millions of dollars he was currently laundering belonged to a violent criminal syndicate. If he ran away with the cartel money, they would hunt him down to the ends of the earth. But if he left the washed money for the cartel, he would need his own private fortune to survive in exile. Maya was his golden ticket. He needed her dead before next Friday. This is no longer a civil dispute over stolen property or a simple marital crisis. I said, my voice hardening into the command register I had not used since my days leading tactical raids. This is a premeditated rescue mission. Brad has placed a ticking clock on my daughter. He has an execution date. If we wait for the family court to handle the restraining order, or if we try to fight him through standard legal channels, she will be dead before we even see the inside of a courtroom. Hank nodded slowly, pushing his keyboard away and rubbing his tired eyes. We have the digital evidence of the money laundering, the forged secondary mortgage, and the newly activated life insurance policy. But if we take this to the local precinct, it will get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. The patrol sergeants will look at the temporary restraining order Brad filed against you, and they will dismiss this entire investigation as the paranoid ramblings of a vengeful father. We need federal intervention, and we need it right this second. "You are absolutely right," I told him, pacing the length of the kitchen, my mind shifting entirely into combat geometry. Brad thinks he has neutralized me by filing a false police report and stripping me of my primary firearm. He thinks I am sitting here helpless, bound by a piece of paper, while he prepares to orchestrate a fatal accident for his wife. He fundamentally misunderstood who he picked a fight with. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and walked over to the front window. I scrolled down to a number I had not dialed in 5 years. It belonged to Special Agent Thomas Vance. Tom and I had worked together on a multi-agency task force a decade ago. We had traded favors and shared intelligence more times than I could count. He understood the necessity of immediate justice. So, I pressed the call button. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Rick," Tom said. "It has been a long time. I thought you were spending your retirement fishing." "I wish I was Tom," I replied. "I need a massive favor. I need you to pull your team together. I have a situation that involves a massive equity fraud and a pending premeditated murder." The warmth immediately vanished from his voice. "Who is the target, Rick?" "My daughter," I said. "Her husband is the primary launderer for an unknown criminal syndicate. He is washing millions of dollars through local commercial real estate. He used forged signatures to purchase an $8 million life insurance policy on my daughter with a double indemnity clause for accidental death. He has one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands booked for next Friday." There was a heavy silence. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard. "You are telling me he is planning to execute your daughter before next Friday?" "That is exactly what I am telling you," I confirmed. "He also filed a fraudulent temporary restraining order against me this morning. He used the local police to disarm me and legally isolate Maya. He is clearing the chessboard, so he can manufacture a fatal accident. Send me everything you have right now, Tom ordered. Who is running the digital forensics on your end? Hank Callahan, I replied. He has the entire data packet mapped out. The routing numbers, the forged documents, and the flight confirmations. We have the entire network boxed up and ready for delivery. The primary architect of the laundering operation is a wealth manager named Diana Pierce. She is traveling with him. I remember Hank, Tom said. If he built the data packet, it is rock solid. Keep your daughter inside your house. Do not let her touch her cell phone. If Brad knows you are looking, he might panic. I am mobilizing a financial crimes strike team. We will be at your house in less than 2 hours. Thank you, Tom, I said quietly. Do not thank me yet, Rick. Just keep her breathing until we get there. I disconnected the call. I turned around to face the kitchen. Maya was standing in the hallway. She had heard every single word of my conversation. Her face was entirely drained of color. The man she loved was actively planning her murder. He is going to kill me, she whispered. No, I said. He is going to try. But he is going to fail. You are staying right here behind these walls. We have the federal government coming. Brad thinks he has outsmarted everyone. He thinks he is the smartest predator in the room. But he is about to find out what happens when you threaten my child. The next 36 hours moved with deliberate velocity. Tom and his federal task force transformed my dining room into a classified forward operating base. They worked alongside Hank, absorbing digital evidence, verifying offshore routing numbers, and coordinating with authorities to freeze the Cayman Island accounts. They placed Maya under physical protection. As Thursday evening approached, the atmosphere shifted to tactical execution. Tomorrow morning, Brad intended to board a flight with Diana Pierce and disappear. Tonight was his absolute deadline to finalize the laundering and sever his ties. Brad was not spending his final night in Chicago packing his bags. He was hosting a high-society real estate gala at a luxury downtown hotel. It was billed as an exclusive networking event to secure capital for his commercial developments. In reality, it was perfectly orchestrated theater. He needed to wash the final batch of cartel money using the gala to legitimize the funds as investor commitments. He was going to stand in a room full of wealthy citizens, drink champagne, and finalize his empire out in the open. He believed I was sitting at home neutralized by a piece of paper stripped of my weapon and terrified of violating a court order. He was wrong. I walked into my bedroom and opened my cedar closet. I bypassed the civilian suits and reached to the back, pulling out the protective bag that held my Class A dress uniform. I had not worn it since the day I retired. The dark navy blue fabric was immaculate, perfectly tailored, and pressed with sharp, rigid creases. I slipped on the uniform shirt, the heavy trousers, and the polished black dress shoes. I stood in front of the mirror, carefully securing the brass buttons and silver captain bars on my collar. I reached into my very top drawer and pulled out a velvet-lined wooden box. Inside rested the physical weight of my 30-year career. I took out my medals of valor, the commendations for tactical leadership, the ribbons for hostage rescue, and the silver star for courage under fire. I pinned every single one to my chest. They were not just decorations. They were a testament to a lifetime spent standing between innocent people and monsters. Tonight, the monster was my son-in-law, and the innocent person was my only child. I did not reach for my secondary tactical holster or slide a combat blade into my boot. Brad had filed a sworn affidavit claiming I was an unhinged man who relied on firearms. I was not going to give him a single shred of physical aggression to use against me. I did not need bullets to destroy Bradley Lawson. I needed truth. I picked up a thick leather folder resting on my dresser. It contained the complete digital forensics report. Hank compiled the offshore banking coordinates, the forged secondary mortgage documents, and a certified copy of the $4 million life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive portfolio of legal destruction. I walked out to the living room. Tom and Hank were standing by the front door, reviewing the final deployment logistics on a tablet. Maya was sitting on the sofa, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. She looked up at me as I entered the room. Her eyes widened, taking in the sharp lines of the dress uniform and the rows of heavy silver medals gleaming on my chest. She had not seen me in this uniform since she was a little girl. "You look like you are going to a parade, Dad," she whispered, a faint, fragile smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I am going to a funeral," I replied softly, walking over and placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "The funeral of his reputation. You stay here with the agents. Lock the doors. Do not answer your phone. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, you will be free of this nightmare." I walked out the front door and stepped into the cold Chicago evening. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, a steady rumble matching the rhythm of my pulse. I pulled out of the driveway and headed toward the glowing skyline of the downtown financial district. The drive took 45 minutes. I drove in absolute silence, mentally rehearsing the geometry of the hotel ballroom, anticipating security checkpoints, and preparing my mind for the confrontation. The luxury hotel was a towering monument of glass and steel, an opulent fortress overlooking the frozen river. I pulled my truck up to the valet stand. The young attendant hurried over, his eyes widening as he took in the authoritative presence of my full dress uniform. He took the keys without a word, treating me with the instinctual deference that the uniform commanded. I grabbed the thick leather folder and walked through the revolving glass doors into the grand lobby. The atmosphere was suffocatingly rich. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the polished marble floors. A soft string quartet played classical music from a raised balcony. Wealthy men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in glittering evening gowns moved gracefully toward the grand ballroom at the end of the main corridor. This was Brad and his world. This was the deceptive theater of prestige he used to mask his criminal reality. I walked purposefully down the wide hallway, my polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone tiles. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom were propped wide open, flanked by 2 private security guards holding digital guest registries. They immediately saw me approaching. They noted the rigid posture, the silver-capped bars, and the unmistakable aura of absolute authority. They did not ask for an invitation. They simply stepped back and cleared the path. I walked through the doorway and stepped into the center of the gala. The room was massive, decorated with towering floral arrangements and shimmering ice sculptures. Waiters carrying silver trays of expensive champagne drifted through the crowd of laughing, wealthy investors. I stood near the entrance, scanning the room with the cold, analytical focus of a predator. It took me less than 30 seconds to locate my target. Brad was standing near the center of the ballroom, directly beneath a cascading chandelier. He looked incredibly handsome, in a sharp midnight blue tuxedo, holding a crystal flute of champagne, radiating an aura of untouchable success. He was smiling warmly, shaking hands with an older gentleman. Standing to his right, looking like a flawless mannequin in a backless silk gown, was Diana Pierce. They looked like the perfect corporate power couple, effortlessly charming the room while secretly finalizing the destruction of my daughter. I tightened my grip on the heavy dark leather folder. The ambient noise of classical music and wealthy laughter faded into a dull, distant roar. The ticking clock had finally completely run out. I began to walk directly across the ballroom floor, parting the crowd like the bow of a massive battleship, cutting through calm waters, bringing the full weight of the truth straight to his feet. I did not rush my approach. I let the heavy, measured rhythm of my footsteps carry me across the polished dance floor. The sea of elegant guests naturally parted, their conversations faltering as they took in the sight of my dark navy blue dress uniform and the silver medals gleaming against the fabric. They were accustomed to seeing waiters and wealthy patrons, not a decorated police captain marching through their celebration with the grim focus of an executioner. 50 feet away, Brad was still laughing at a joke made by an elderly investor. He raised his crystal flute of champagne to take a sip. And then he saw me. The transformation was instantaneous. The charming, confident smile melted off his face, replaced by a rigid mask of absolute shock. The champagne flute halted halfway to his lips. For a fraction of a second, I saw the genuine terror in his eyes. He knew I should not be there. He knew the temporary restraining order was supposed to keep me paralyzed, locked inside my house under the threat of immediate arrest. But the terror quickly vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant fury. Brad set his glass down on a passing waiter and his silver tray. He leaned over and whispered something to Diana Pierce. The beautiful wealth manager narrowed her eyes, her gaze locking onto me like a targeting laser. Brad raised his hand and gave a sharp, subtle signal to a pair of men standing near the perimeter of the chandelier. They were not standard hotel security. They wore tailored charcoal suits and had the distinct muscular build of private executive protection. They moved with aggressive speed, cutting through the guests to intercept my path. The larger of the two men, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a coiled earpiece, stepped directly in front of me, completely blocking my way to Brad. He planted his feet and held up a large calloused hand, pressing it firmly against the center of my chest. "Hold it right there, sir," the lead guard said, his voice a low, threatening rumble designed not to carry over the classical music playing from the balcony. "You are in violation of a court-mandated restraining order. Mr. Lawson alerted us to the situation this morning. If you take one more step toward him, I am authorized to use physical force to detain you until the Chicago police arrive. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now." I stopped. I did not swat his hand away. I simply looked at the guard, my posture perfectly straight, my grip remaining firm on the thick leather folder resting at my side. 10 feet away, Brad was watching the confrontation. The arrogant, smug smile had returned to his face. He felt entirely untouchable. He believed his wealth, his private security, and his manipulated legal documents made him an invincible predator. He thought the law was a shield he could hide behind while he finalized the murder of my daughter. "You are making a very serious mistake," I told the private guard, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and calm. "I strongly suggest you remove your hand from my uniform." The guard sneered, leaning closer. "The only mistake being made here is yours, old man," the guard growled. "I know exactly who you are. You do not have a badge anymore, and you do not have any authority in this room. Turn around, or I will put you on the ground and let the patrol boys haul you away in handcuffs." Brad took a confident step forward, stopping just behind his wall of private muscle. "You heard the man, Rick," Brad said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. He pitched his words loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, playing the role of the tragic, victimized son-in-law. "You need to go home. You are having an episode. I do not want to see you get arrested, but you are violating a direct order from a federal judge. Please do not make me ruin your life." He was performing for the crowd. He was building his alibi in real time, making sure dozens of wealthy witnesses saw him acting with compassion toward his deranged father-in-law. It was a brilliant sociopathic performance. Diana Pierce watched me closely from the shadows, her arms crossed, calculating every single variable. I did not look at Brad. I kept my eyes locked on the lead security guard, pressing his hand into my chest. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension in the room stretch until it was ready to snap. "I am not here to arrest him," I said quietly. Before the private guard could respond, 2 men stepped out from the crowded perimeter of the ballroom. They had been blending seamlessly into the gala, wearing dark conservative suits that made them look like mid-level financial analysts. They moved with synchronized, practiced efficiency, stepping directly up to the back of the private security detail. The man on the left reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a bright gold shield and federal credentials. He shoved the badge directly into the face of the lead security guard. The music from the balcony seemed to fade into a hollow hum. The guard immediately stiffened, his eyes darting from the gold shield to the stern, uncompromising face of the federal agent holding it. "Special Agent Thomas Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Tom stated, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "Financial Crimes Division. You need to remove your hand from the captain right this second." The private guard swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as the reality of the badge registered in his mind. "But sir," the guard stammered, lowering his hand immediately and taking a small step back. "This man has an active temporary restraining order against him. He is not supposed to be within 500 feet of this event." Tom did not even blink. He took a step closer, crowding the physical space of the massive guard, radiating an intense, overwhelming federal authority. "Captain Dalton is not here as a private citizen," Tom explained, his tone completely flat and devoid of any room for negotiation. "He is currently acting as a designated expert consultant for an active federal investigation. The restraining order is entirely superseded by federal jurisdiction. Now step aside, or I will have you arrested for obstruction of justice and interfering with a federal operation." The two private security guards looked at each other, realizing instantly that they were entirely out of their depth. Without another word, they parted, stepping back into the shadows of the crowd, leaving Brad completely exposed. The smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from his handsome face. He stared at Tom, then at the second agent, and finally his panicked gaze locked onto me. The protective walls he had built with his dirty money and his manipulated court orders had collapsed in less than 10 seconds. I walked through the gap left by the security guards, closing the remaining distance to personally hand him his final fate. Brad realized his private security had evaporated. His immediate instinct was to retreat toward the illusion of power. He turned and quickly stepped onto the raised mahogany stage. Grasping a microphone from the podium, he tried to control the narrative, desperate to drown out my presence. He raised his crystal flute of champagne, projecting a flawless smile that belied his sudden absolute terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brad announced, his amplified voice booming through the heavy speakers and echoing beautifully across the crystal chandeliers. "I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. We stand on the precipice of a monumental expansion, and your massive investments are our shared financial future." The beautiful string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The murmur of polite conversation faded as attendees turned their attention. But they were not looking at Brad. As I marched down the center aisle, the crowd naturally parted. The wealthy investors fell dead silent at the sight of a uniformed police captain cutting through their celebration. The silver medals of valor pinned to my chest caught the light of the chandeliers flashing with every deliberate step I took. Brad stood frozen on the stage, his knuckles turning white around his crystal champagne stem. He looked down at me as I closed the final few yards, his charming smile decaying into a mask of pure panic. He opened his mouth to call for security, but the words died in his throat. He had no leverage left. He had no shadows left to hide behind. His terrible, impending destruction had finally arrived. I reached the edge of the stage, stopping directly in front of the VIP table. Diana Pierce sat at the exact center, her eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits. She was calculating her escape, but Special Agent Tom Vance and his federal team had already secured the perimeter. They stood quietly by the heavy oak doors, completely blocking the only way out. I lifted the thick leather folder containing the digital forensics report, the offshore banking coordinates, and the forged mortgage documents. I raised it high enough for Diana to see the financial web she had built captured in my hands. With a sudden, violent motion, I slammed the folder down onto the center of the VIP table. The explosive crack of the leather echoed like a gunshot through the ballroom. Diana gasped, shrinking back into her chair. I did not wait for an invitation. I stepped up onto the stage. Brad instinctively backed away, stumbling against the polished wooden podium. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. He did not resist me at all. He simply let go, staring at me with the hollow, defeated eyes of a man who realized he had lost everything. I turned to face the sea of wealthy investors. Hundreds of eyes were locked onto me, waiting in breathless anticipation. I held the microphone close, ensuring my voice would be heard in every single corner of the massive room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering authority. "The man standing behind me, the man currently asking for your money, just illegally mortgaged his battered wife and her home to cover his offshore laundering tracks." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy patrons exchanged shocked, bewildered glances. Some lowered their crystal champagne flutes. Others took a step back, instinctively distancing themselves from the stage. You believe you are investing in legitimate commercial real estate developments. I continued, my gaze sweeping across the crowd. You believe you are participating in a lucrative legal expansion, but you are funding a mirage. Bradley Lawson is not a real estate visionary. He is a professional launderer moving massive volumes of illicit currency for a violent criminal syndicate. The properties he buys are nothing more than washing machines designed to scrub dirty cartel money. And the woman sitting right there at the VIP table, Diana Pierce, is the architect of the shell company network hiding those stolen funds. Diana buried her face in her hands, realizing her flawless corporate camouflage had been completely stripped away. Murmurs of outrage and disbelief began to build among the guests. Brad tried to salvage the unsalvageable. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do not listen to him. He is a sick, confused old man. He is having a mental breakdown. I filed a restraining order against him this morning. Security, get him out of here." No one moved a muscle. The private guards remained pinned near the exit by the federal agents. I did not even look at Brad. I kept my attention focused entirely on the crowd. He filed a fraudulent restraining order to legally isolate my daughter because she discovered his burner phone. I explained, my voice cutting through his panicked lies. When she confronted him, he struck her. But the abuse and financial fraud are merely the beginning. This man who just offered a toast to your future realized his criminal network was compromised, so he accelerated his exit strategy. Yesterday, he used a forged signature to extract $800,000 from the home I purchased for my daughter. He did not use that money to pay debts. He used it to buy a $4 million life insurance policy on my only child. The murmurs in the crowd instantly ceased. The absolute horror of the accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "The policy contains a double indemnity clause for accidental death," I stated, feeling the cold fury rising in my chest. "If my daughter dies in a tragic accident, the payout becomes $8 million in untraceable cash." And to complete his grand illusion, he has already purchased 2 one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands for himself and Miss Pierce, departing this coming Friday. He was planning to execute his wife, collect the bounty wash, the blood money through his offshore accounts, and disappear entirely with your investments. I turned slowly to face Brad. He was backed tightly against the heavy velvet curtains draped behind the stage, trembling uncontrollably. His face was slick with a cold sweat. The charismatic, untouchable executive had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered coward. "You thought you could blind me with legal paperwork," I told him, dropping the microphone onto the podium. "You thought you could strip me of my weapon and force me to sit quietly while you placed an expiration date on my daughter. You thought you were the smartest predator in the room. But you forgot that a father defending his child does not need a gun to tear your empire down to the very ground." I stepped down from the raised stage and walked back to the VIP table. I picked up the heavy leather folder and slowly turned toward the back of the massive ballroom. Special Agent Tom Vance stepped forward, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests. The heavy oak doors suddenly swung wide open, and the flashing red and blue lights of the Chicago police cruisers brightly illuminated the hotel lobby windows. The rescue mission was finally and absolutely complete. Brad stared at the flashing lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. The absolute finality of his situation had not quite penetrated his profound arrogance. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from the heavily armed federal agents blocking the massive oak doors to the Chicago police officers securing the lobby just beyond them. He looked back at me, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. The sudden influx of law enforcement should have forced him into submission, but his narcissistic mind refused to accept defeat. He firmly believed he could talk his way out of any corner, that his charm and his carefully constructed corporate facade would somehow shield him from the staggering weight of federal justice. He forced a loud, grating laugh that echoed awkwardly through the dead silence of the grand ballroom. He stepped away from the heavy velvet curtains, and moved back toward the center of the stage, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "This is all a massive misunderstanding," Brad announced, his voice projecting a desperate, hollow confidence to the stunned crowd of wealthy investors. "My father-in-law is a severely troubled man. He is suffering from advanced dementia. He is senile, confused, and prone to violent delusions. I tried to handle this privately for the sake of my wife, which is why I filed the restraining order this morning. He has clearly fabricated these insane allegations because he resents my financial success." Brad turned his attention to the federal agents standing at the perimeter of the room. "Officers, please, you must see what is happening here," he pleaded, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening display of false sincerity. "This man is having a complete psychological breakdown. There is no money laundering. There is no offshore cartel account. We are a legitimate, fully licensed commercial real estate development firm." He pointed an accusing finger directly at my chest. "Remove him from this premises immediately and get him the psychiatric help he so desperately needs." When neither Tom Vance nor his tactical team moved a single inch, Brad began to genuinely panic. The charming facade cracked, revealing the frantic, cornered rat beneath. He spun around and looked frantically at Diana Pierce. The beautiful wealth manager was still sitting at the VIP table, her face pale, her posture rigid with terror. "Diana, tell them," Brad commanded, his voice pitching higher with sudden, sharp desperation. "Tell these agents about our corporate compliance. Show them our certified portfolios. Explain to them that every single dollar in our accounts is clean documented and fully accounted for." Diana opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the federal badges, then at the heavy leather folder I had slammed onto her table, and finally at Brad. She was a brilliant financial architect, a woman who had built an entire career on calculating risk, and she knew instantly that the math in this room was no longer in their favor. I stood perfectly still, letting Brad twist in the wind of his own collapsing lies. "You are right about one thing, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "You are a meticulous planner. You built a phenomenal digital fortress, but you were so focused on hiding your money in the Cayman Islands that you completely ignored your immediate physical surroundings. When my colleague Hank breached your servers last night, he did not just trace your routing numbers. He traced the GPS coordinates of your personal vehicle. And while you were busy at the courthouse this morning filing a fraudulent restraining order to keep me away from your house, Hank paid a visit to the parking garage." Brad froze, a new and entirely different kind of fear washing over his face. He took a hesitant step backward. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped a few buttons. The hotel ballroom was equipped with a state-of-the-art wireless public address system. The string quartet had been using it to amplify their music just moments before. I synced my device directly to the central audio console. Hank placed a tiny voice-activated digital recording bug under the dashboard of your luxury sedan, I explained calmly, holding the phone up for him to see. He knew you would be making arrangements for your final exit. He knew you would have to coordinate with your cartel handlers before you boarded your flight on Friday. And he was absolutely right. You made a very interesting phone call on your way to this hotel tonight. I pressed the digital play button on my screen. A sharp burst of static crackled through the massive speakers suspended around the ballroom, followed by the unmistakable, crystal-clear voice of Bradley Lawson. The audio filled the vast space, bouncing off the walls and washing over the hundreds of guests. "Everything is set," Brad's recorded voice declared through the speakers. "The final transfer happens tonight at the gala. As soon as the investors clear their checks, the money washes through the real estate holding firm and shoots directly to the offshore proxy." A deep, heavily accented voice replied through the recording, presumably the cartel associate on the other end of the line. And the woman, the financial manager. Does she suspect the final routing diversion? Brad laughed on the recording, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a visible shudder through the ballroom. "Diana is just a dumb mule," his voice echoed loudly. "She thinks we are splitting the commission and retiring on the beach. She has no idea I built a secondary backdoor into her personal accounts. The second the money clears in the Caymans on Friday morning, I am wiping her accounts completely clean and dumping her. Let the feds and the cartel tear her apart. By the time anyone figures out where the money actually went, I will be a ghost. I tapped my screen, stopping the audio playback. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The investors stared at Brad in utter revulsion. But the most dramatic reaction came from the VIP table. Diana Pierce sat perfectly motionless for 2 full seconds, processing the audio recording. The man she had conspired with, the man she had risked a lifetime in federal prison for, was planning to steal her entire cut, drain her life savings, and leave her behind as a sacrificial lamb for a violent criminal syndicate. The blood rushed entirely out of her face. She realized instantly that her only chance of surviving was to burn Bradley Lawson to the ground. She reached down and grabbed her expensive designer purse. She shoved her hand violently inside, pulling out a thick, black encrypted USB flash drive containing every single unencrypted routing number they had ever used. Diana sprinted across the ballroom floor, running straight toward Tom Vance. "I have everything," Diana screamed, shoving the drive into his chest. "I want full immunity." Brad finally collapsed onto the floor, realizing his entire empire was entirely gone. Diana Pierce collapsed into the arms of the federal agents, sobbing hysterically as she surrendered the black flash drive. Tom Vance secured the encrypted drive, holding the undeniable proof of a massive international laundering operation. The federal tactical team moved with swift precision, establishing complete control over the panicked ballroom. Brad remained on the polished hardwood floor, staring blankly at the woman chieftain who had just delivered his federal indictment. The deep, poisonous arrogance that had fueled his entire adult life would not allow him to surrender with dignity. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, brushing the dust from his knees. His chest heaved as he locked his gaze onto me. The charming facade was gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered malice. He looked around at the federal agents, knowing his escape to the Cayman Islands was permanently canceled. If he was going to fall into the abyss, he was determined to drag my family down into the darkness with him. He stepped toward me, his hands balled into tight fists. "You think you have won this game, Rick?" Brad snarled, a wet, ugly laugh tearing from his throat. "You think wearing that ridiculous costume makes you a hero? You think you swooped in here and saved your precious daughter from the big bad wolf? You are completely delusional. I might be going to prison, but I made absolutely sure that Maya is going to suffer for the rest of her miserable life. You did not save her. You just delayed the inevitable." I did not move. I let him speak, allowing the federal agents and the dozens of remaining gala attendees to witness the true nature of his character. "I still pulled $800,000 in pure cash out of that house." Brad continued, his voice practically vibrating with spiteful triumph. "I drained every single drop of equity you poured into that property. The money is washed, scattered, and entirely untraceable. I stopped making the secondary mortgage payments 2 months ago." "Do you know what that means, old man? The bank is coming for her. They are going to throw your precious daughter out on the street tomorrow morning. She will be drowning in a massive mountain of debt she can never repay. I broke her, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to fix it." He was panting, his face flushed with the exertion of his hateful monologue. He waited for my reaction. He wanted to see me lose control, to shout, to strike him, to validate his twisted sense of superiority. Instead, I maintained a posture of absolute stillness. The heavy brass buttons of my uniform reflected the light as I took one slow, deliberate step forward. I closed the distance until I was standing merely inches from his face. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Did you really think a 30-year veteran police commander would hand over $1 million house to a man like you without installing a safety net?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. "Did you honestly believe I would pour my entire life savings into a piece of real estate and leave it vulnerable to a marital dispute? You spent all your time studying corporate loopholes and offshore banking laws, But you clearly never bothered to read the actual deed to your own primary residence. Brad blinked, his malicious smile faltering slightly. The absolute certainty in my voice sent a visible tremor through his shoulders. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his defiant glare. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, the bravado suddenly leaking out of his tone. "When I purchased that home for Maya 3 years ago, I did not just wire the money into a joint escrow account. I explained, articulating every single syllable with punishing clarity. I hired an independent estate attorney. I placed the entire property into an irrevocable trust in my daughter and her name. I structured the trust with a specific encumbrance clause. That house belongs entirely to the trust, not to Maya as an individual, and certainly not to you as her spouse. It cannot be legally mortgaged or used as collateral under any circumstances. It is absolutely bulletproof." Brad took a tiny involuntary step backward. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape from the crushing weight of my words. But there was nowhere left to run. "You did not steal from me, Brad," I continued, leaning slightly closer to deliver the final devastating blow. "I did not lose a single penny, and Maya is not going to lose her house. When you forged her signature to secure that secondary loan, the bank processed the paperwork, assuming you held legal equity. But because the property is locked inside a trust, the collateral you offered them simply does not exist. You used forged documents to steal $800,000 directly from a federally insured lending institution." I let the silence hang in the air for 3 full seconds, watching the color completely drain from his face as the terrifying reality of his situation crystallized in his mind. "That is first-degree federal bank fraud," I stated, my voice echoing like a final gavel strike in an empty courtroom. "The FBI does not care about your messy divorce, and they do not care about your marital disputes, but they care very deeply about individuals defrauding federal banks. That single charge carries a mandatory minimum sentence. You are looking at 30 years in a federal penitentiary before they even begin to prosecute you for the money laundering and the wire fraud. You just handed the prosecution a perfectly wrapped, undeniable federal felony." The realization shattered Brad completely. His knees buckled under the immense pressure of his own catastrophic failures. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing weakly as if trying to catch himself on invisible ropes. He hit the edge of the stage and slid down to the hardwood floor. The handsome, untouchable executive was gone. In his place was a hollow, trembling shell of a man gasping for air as the walls of his criminal enterprise collapsed directly on top of him. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in a silent plea for a mercy he did not deserve. Special Agent Tom Vance stepped forward from the shadows, flanking Brad with 2 heavily armed tactical agents. Vance looked down at the trembling man with profound professional disgust. "Bradley Lawson," Vance announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder." The agents hauled Brad roughly to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He hung his head, his expensive tuxedo jacket riding up awkwardly around his neck as they marched him away from the stage and toward the exit. I stood in the center of the gala watching the flashing red and blue lights waiting for him outside the glass doors. The rescue mission was over. I watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind them, sealing the fate of the man who had tried to destroy my family. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered, replaced by a rising, chaotic tide of panicked voices. The illusion of high society sophistication completely disintegrated. The wealthy investors who just moments ago had been eager to hand over their fortunes to a charismatic fraud were now scattering like roaches exposed to a sudden blinding light. Men in tailored tuxedos abandoned their crystal champagne flutes on empty tables, rushing toward the coat check and the secondary exits. Women in elegant evening gowns pulled their partners along, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic federal raid unfolding in front of them. None of them wanted their names associated with a cartel money laundering operation. They fled. I turned and walked slowly toward the lobby, the sharp, authoritative click of my polished dress shoes echoing against the marble floors. I stepped through those revolving doors and out into the crisp, cool Chicago night air. Emergency lights illuminated the street. Half a dozen federal vehicles and local police cruisers formed a secure perimeter around the hotel entrance. Brad was standing near the rear door of a dark, armored federal transport vehicle. The silent, defeated posture he had shown inside the ballroom had entirely evaporated the moment the cold night air hit his face. The reality of his situation finally crushed his narcissistic delusions. He began to thrash against the grip of the tactical agents holding his arms. His perfectly styled hair fell wildly across his forehead, and his expensive midnight blue tuxedo jacket ripped at the shoulder seam as he desperately tried to pull away. He was weeping openly, large, ugly tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. His chest heaved with violent, ragged sobs as he begged the agents to listen to him. "Please, you do not understand," Brad cried out, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "I was forced into this. They made me do it. I am a victim. You have to let me call my lawyer. You cannot put me in there. I will give you everything. I will tell you everything you want to know about the cartel. Just please do not put me in the car." Special Agent Tom Vance stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his face a mask of absolute professional indifference. He watched as the tactical unit forcefully guided Brad toward the open door of the transport vehicle. Brad dug his polished shoes into the pavement, twisting his neck to look back at the hotel entrance. His desperate, searching gaze landed directly on me. "Rick." "Please," Brad screamed, the sheer terror in his voice cutting through the noise of the idling police engines. "Please talk to them. Tell them I am family. Tell them I did not mean to hurt Maya. I was just scared. I will give the house back. I will sign anything you want. Just please help me. Do not let them take me away." I stood perfectly still on the hotel steps, the silver medals on my dress uniform catching the glare of the emergency lights. I looked down at the trembling, sobbing coward who had coldly calculated the price of my daughter and her life. I did not offer him a single word of comfort, nor did I grant him the satisfaction of a final, triumphant insult. I simply looked at him with complete and absolute indifference, exactly as one would look at a discarded piece of trash on the side of the road. Tom Vance gave a sharp nod to his men. The agents pushed Brad down, forcing him into the cramped, dark interior of the armored transport. They slammed the heavy steel door shut instantly, cutting off his pathetic wailing. The lock engaged with a loud final click, permanently separating Bradley Lawson from the world of freedom and privilege he had so arrogantly abused. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold air clear the residual adrenaline from my lungs. Tom Vance walked over to me, holding a thick clipboard filled with federal custody forms and witness affidavits. He offered me a grim, respectful smile. "The tactical precision of this operation was flawless," Tom said, handing me a silver pen. "We have Diana Pierce secured in the second transport vehicle." She handed over the encrypted flash drive without a single fight. "She is currently singing like a bird, giving us the names, routing numbers, and offshore accounts of every single cartel associate involved in the network. She thinks offering full cooperation will secure her a lighter sentence, but bank fraud is bank fraud. They are both going away for a very long time." I took the pen and began signing my name on the designated lines of the federal documents. I confirmed the transfer of the digital forensics packet, formally documented my statements regarding the forged mortgage, and relinquished any further involvement in the criminal prosecution. I pressed the pen firmly against the paper, feeling a tremendous physical weight lifting from my shoulders with every stroke. "You did a good thing tonight, Rick," Tom said quietly, watching me complete the paperwork. "You saved your daughter, and you dismantled a sophisticated criminal syndicate. You took down a dangerous predator without firing a single shot. Your badge might be retired, but your instincts are as sharp as they ever were." I handed the clipboard back to Tom. "I did what a father is supposed to do," I replied, my voice steady and calm. He thought he could use the law as a weapon to destroy my family. He thought paperwork and corporate manipulation made him untouchable. I just showed him that a real protector does not need violence to break a monster. Sometimes the most devastating weapon you can wield is the absolute, undeniable truth. Tom nodded in agreement. He extended his hand, and we shared a firm, respectful handshake. "Go home to your daughter, Rick," Tom instructed gently. "The FBI has the scene secured. The Financial Crimes Division, FON, will spend the next several months seizing his assets, freezing the offshore accounts, and dismantling the shell companies. Bradley Lawson will never cast a shadow over your family again." I turned away from the flashing lights and walked toward the valet stand, leaving the chaotic aftermath of the federal raid behind me. I climbed into my truck and closed the door, shutting out the blaring sirens. I placed my hands on the leather steering wheel and stared out through the windshield at the dark, empty road stretching out ahead. The profound silence inside the vehicle was a stark contrast to the absolute destruction I had just unleashed upon Bradley Lawson. I put the engine into gear and pulled away from the curb, driving out of the financial district with a singular overriding purpose. I was no longer a tactical police commander operating in a combat zone. I was just a simple father driving back home to his only child, carrying the absolute greatest gift I could ever possibly give her. The absolute certainty that the terrible storm had finally passed and she was completely safe. The early morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Chicago skyline in soft hues of amber and gray. I pulled my truck into the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the quiet neighborhood. I stepped out, my legs stiff, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. The weight that had crushed my chest since the moment I learned of the forged mortgage had finally evaporated, replaced by a deep, hollow sense of peace. I walked to the front door, my boots feeling heavier with every step. The house looked exactly as I had left it, standing as a silent, sturdy sanctuary against the storm. I turned the key, the mechanism clicking smoothly, and stepped inside. The living room was bathed in the pale, cool light of dawn. I heard the faint, rhythmic sound of a coffee grinder coming from the kitchen. Maya was standing at the island, wearing my old, oversized sweater. She was pouring 2 mugs of steaming, dark roast coffee. When she heard me, she looked up. Her eyes were red from crying, but the frantic, hunted expression that had defined her face for days was gone. She set the mugs down and walked toward me. There were no dramatic speeches or tearful, chaotic outbursts. She simply stepped into my arms and held me with a strength that surprised me. I felt her forehead press against my chest, and for a long moment, we just stood there in the quiet of the morning. The house was safe. The financial trap had been sprung and neutralized. The predator was locked away where he could never reach her again. I leaned down, took off my uniform jacket, and draped it over the kitchen chair. I unpinned the heavy brass badges and medals one by one, setting them on the table. My duty as a captain was finished, but my role as a father remained. We sat at the island, the silence between us comfortable and earned. The nightmare that had threatened to consume everything we held dear was over. My daughter was alive, she was free, and she was home. I looked out the window as the sun climbed higher, watching the city wake up to a world where justice had actually prevailed. I knew the legal fallout would consume the headlines for weeks, and the investigators would be busy with the remnants of Brad and Diana's network, but that was no longer my concern. My concern was the coffee in my hand and the steady, rhythmic breathing of my daughter beside me. I had dismantled the man who tried to break her, not with a weapon, but with the cold, unyielding power of the truth. We had finally reached the dawn of our new life, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew with absolute certainty that we were going to be all right. Family is not a free pass for abuse, and blind trust is the greatest vulnerability a person can have. We spend our lives building safe havens for our children, hoping our love will shield them from the world's cruelty. But predators don't respect love. They exploit it. True protection isn't just providing comfort. It is remaining vigilant, setting unbreakable boundaries, and having the courage to ruthlessly dismantle anyone who threatens your blood. Never mistake a father's quiet patience for weakness. When the line is crossed, the kindest men will become the most dangerous to protect their own. Did this story of justice and a father's fierce love resonate with you? Let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. If you want more thrilling stories like this, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. See you in the next one.